Well, today we're here to listen to Sidney Blumenthal. Now, many of you will know him in his past incarnations. He was a very noted political journalist, especially for the Washington Post and the New Yorker. Later, he was a senior advisor to Bill Clinton in the White House, and later still a senior advisor to Hillary Clinton. But he's here in his capacity as biographer of Lincoln. Sidney has already written 3 brilliant volumes of his 5-volume biography of the great man. Pamela, I wonder if you can quickly show us the 3 volumes that have appeared so far, which take Lincoln, I think, to the brink of his presidency. So we go, this is a later picture of Lincoln. And here is the first volume. And Sidney is going to talk to us today about Lincoln the man and how someone starting in such an unpropitious place ends up in the White House, possibly the most transformational American president of all time. Because Sidney, and welcome, and we are speaking at a time that I think Lincoln would have found fascinating, a moment in American history. Most politicians of Lincoln's day were wealthy men, many of them slave owners. Lincoln was anything but. Can you talk us through the beginnings to start with?
Yes, first of all, I'm delighted to be here at Pandemonium U and coming into Paris, where I understand the cafes are slightly opening. And it's better than being in Pandemonium, Washington right now. The U is more calm than the city. Abraham Lincoln, about which someone said, there's nothing new to learn about Lincoln, but I found that there was an immense amount to be learned about Lincoln that was new, and there were new insights to shed upon him. He is, if anything, the classic figure who rises from a literal log cabin and poverty to the presidency. He is a self-willed, self-educated man who rises entirely by his own abilities. He represents to himself in his own story the kind of open democracy that he wound up defending and fighting for in the Civil War against the slave power, an oligarchy, and a slave society. Lincoln was born in a small town, I wouldn't even call it that, in rural Kentucky, to illiterate, poor dirt farmer parents. They were highly unusual in its day, I discovered, in that they belonged, he was born in 1809, they belonged to a primitive Baptist emancipationist church. So when Lincoln said, I am naturally anti-slavery, he meant naturally. He was sort of born to it. His parents, while illiterate, were opposed to slavery. His father felt that he could receive no opportunity in Kentucky because he was struggling for wages against slaves and fled across the Ohio River into Indiana, where Lincoln spent his boyhood. Much later, and this is a revealing incident, Lincoln says, when he assumes his new identity as a member of this new party that he has formed in Illinois, the Republican Party, he tells a campaign crowd in 1856, I used to be a slave, and then he jokes, but now they let me practice law. Well, underneath that is some authentic truth about Lincoln's self-perception. He did regard himself as a slave to his father, who was an illiterate man and who did not believe that Lincoln should even learn to read, and thought it was a waste of time, and actually hit him when he wasted time reading. His stepmother protected him from his father. He was alienated from his father, and his father rented him out as an indentured servant to earn his wages. And Lincoln, in one of his dictated autobiographies in the 1860 campaign, describes his father in unflattering terms. He says he could only blunderingly sign his name with an X, and he was poorly educated. Lincoln says that he himself is poorly educated. he also says his father was a wandering labor boy, and that's undoubtedly true, but so was Lincoln. He was a wandering labor boy. And what he did in Indiana as a boy was wander around and find men who had their own private libraries and read in them. And that was the first time he read the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, which was the basis and framework of all of his politics. All men are created equal, especially, and read law books. And he did this all as a boy. He attended no real schools. He attended what was called a blab school for a few weeks, and was always educating himself throughout his entire life, reading voraciously, and considered his education inadequate and spotty, and yet was extraordinarily well-read in areas that would surprise us today, including science. Lincoln was very much a man of science and was the only president to hold a patent for an invention and was a patent lawyer, and founded the National Academy of Sciences, and would be startled at the anti-scientific attitude prevailing in the White House today.
What was his patent for?
Excuse me, Simon?
What did he take out a patent for?
Lincoln arrives in the town of New Salem, which is a river town that has suddenly sprung up in Illinois after leaving his family at the age of 21. And he's working on a boat, and the boat gets stuck on the Sangamon River, and Lincoln has to pry it out physically, remove the rocks, and get the boat down there. And Lincoln, over time, is consumed with the idea of boats being lifted through difficulty. And he invents a way so that a boat has balloons on the side and can lift itself above obstacles. And he patents this later in his life in the 1840s. But even more interestingly, he becomes a serious patent lawyer and defends people who are engaged in the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, mass production, and inventions. And Lincoln is completely fascinated with how things work. There's a story of Lincoln walking into a hotel and seeing a telegraph operator for the first time. The telegraph is the internet, and it is a revolutionary invention. And Lincoln is about to go to dinner, but instead he sits down with the operator and insists that he tell him exactly how it works. So Lincoln's mind was fertile and curious and open.
It was very open.
Go ahead.
Sorry, can I just say, it was very open. I was struck by the fact that he did not believe in the divinity of Jesus, which was quite a revolutionary belief in his day.
Lincoln's religion's a matter of contention and mystery down to the present day. And no one really knows what he believed, because he held this very closely to him. But when he was young, he read Tom Paine's Age of Reason, and he read French philosophes, and he came to believe that Jesus was not divine. He wrote a treatise about Jesus's absence of divinity that a friend of his grabbed out of his hands and burned for fear that it would ruin him in his life. Lincoln was deeply immersed in a frontier Calvinist society of evangelical and primitive Baptist churches, and all sorts of sectarian Protestant churches on the frontier. And he instinctively recoiled against this Calvinism, even though it was deeply imbued in him, including a sense of fatalism. Lincoln intensely disliked preachers as a class as a young man. And he disliked how they held their power in local communities over young other people and condemn them as sinful and ruin their lives by making them outcasts in these small communities. And that was part of his rebellion against established religion. Lincoln visited many churches and was steeped in scriptures, but he never joined a church and never belonged to organized religion. While others claimed he was deeply Christian, his wife said he was not Christian. In her sense, you had to join a church. And while he would go to church occasionally with her, he refused to join a church.
One of the most striking things about Lincoln, having looked at lots of photographs of him, was his physical awkwardness. Let's look at this first picture of him, first photograph of him ever taken. What manner of a man do we see here?
This is the first photograph of Lincoln. He's stiff because in order to take a photograph, you have to maintain a static position for a long period of time for the exposure of a daguerreotype. Lincoln is presenting himself, and remember his origins, as coming from the roughest and poorest of classes, as a highly respectable man. Undoubtedly his wife prepared him for this photograph because she was very concerned about his respectability. He's also a politician to the marrow of his bones. He's a public man. He's presenting himself to the public. He's a member of the Whig Party. He had belonged to the Whig Party virtually his whole life until it collapsed. And the Whig Party is, among other things, the party of townspeople and reform, personal improvement, and respectability. And that's what Lincoln is trying to show here. What's interesting is there's no movement, but somehow his eyes seem to be staring and moved and fixed. And there's an intensity to his eyes that shows a kind of, I think we can attribute it to him, ambition and purpose.
You mentioned his wife, Mary. We have a couple of composite pictures of her here. These were taken separately and later kind of cut together. She played a very significant role in his political rise.
Yeah, here she is on the right with Lincoln. This is another angle on that first picture of Lincoln with her in a very early picture. These are sort of contemporaneous photographs. And on the left, you see Lincoln in the White House and Mary. These are composite pictures. Mary, there are some historians, many of them, who disparage Mary Todd Lincoln as what the boys, Lincoln's aides, John Hay and John Nicolay, called the she-wolf. But there was no Lincoln without Mary. She made him what he was. She gave him a family, she gave him a position, and he married up. She was highly educated, she could speak French. She was educated at a French finishing school. She was of a prominent family from Lexington, Kentucky. It was a slaveholding family. Her father was one of the most prominent men in Kentucky. He was the business partner and political ally of Henry Clay, the most powerful and distinguished man in the state of Kentucky and in the nation. And she was brought by an elder sister to Springfield to meet a marriageable man. And instead, she fixed her bonnet on Abraham Lincoln, who her family did not approve of and considered to be, as they called him, a plebe. But she thought she could improve him. She was very political. She came from a Whig family. She was called a volatile little Whig as a child. She had famously ridden up in a pony to Henry Clay's house at about the age of 9, dismounted, and declared to Clay that she wanted to marry the President of the United States. He had run for president. And when she and Lincoln were married, and there were just the two of them. She called them our Lincoln Party. She was a political wife. She was also very ambitious. About Lincoln, his law partners said, William Henry Herndon, his ambition was like a little engine that knew no stop, but actually it did stop sometimes. He would get depressed. He did suffer from depression. And he also doubted himself. And he had these inner insecurities about himself, partly because of his origins. But that's when Mary would step in and kick him forward, because she had no doubts about his ability and his rightful place in the world.
And through her family, he also got a glimpse of the slave-owning world. Is that right to say?
There's an incident that's I've put together in the beginning of my second volume, Wrestling with His Angel. Lincoln has concluded his one term in Congress, 2 years. He's not very distinguished. The Todd family has hired him as the co-counsel to recover the family fortune. Mary's fathers died of cholera in an epidemic. There were epidemics then that just swept through the country. It even killed the president, Zachary Taylor. And Lincoln comes to Lexington, Kentucky to look at this case called Todd Ayers v. Wycliffe. Wycliffe is married the Todd cousin, and somehow she had it. There were problems with the will, and she had all the Todd money, quite considerable, and he inherited it when she died. And he was the leader of the pro-slavery forces in Kentucky, the equivalent of the far right today. And all in one, the Tea Party and the Koch brothers and Donald Trump, and they were trying to write a new state constitution to knock down all the Kentucky laws that had inhibited the slave trade in the state of Kentucky. And Lincoln watched this firsthand as he was battling this legal case, which he lost. And the Todd family lost all of their money to this person who was their sworn enemy. Lincoln watched close up the power of the pro-slavery forces politically as well at the time. And there's a secret in all this. The secret is that there is a true heir beyond any of these people, because the Todd woman, the cousin who had died, had a son who had also died as a young man. But before he had died, he had had a child by her maid. Her maid, of course, was a slave. And that child, who she raised in her own house without ever acknowledging him, was also a slave, a mulatto child. And she emancipated him and sent him to Liberia, where he, and here's the kicker, years later became the president of Liberia, which meant that Mary Lincoln was related to two presidents.
Okay, so Lincoln is a minor provincial politician. He has lost this crucial legal case. Meanwhile, the country is having all sorts of big arguments and attempted compromises about slavery. How, in the end, does he emerge from this mess as the president about to take over when the country is about to collapse into war?
So Lincoln is basically finished in his political life. He's a lawyer riding initially broken down horses and buckboard wagons in central Illinois from courthouse to courthouse, then railroads as they come in. Suddenly his longtime rival, Stephen A. Douglas, a senator from Illinois, leader of the Democratic Party and a great national figure who is very ambitious to become president, passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, sponsors it. That opens up the territory in the West to conflict over whether or not it will be free or slave. As part of this compromise that Douglas engineers, the Missouri Compromise is erased, which had drawn a line across the country, and Kansas was north of it, prohibiting slavery. And so everything is opened up again. And Lincoln says, we ran to the conflict to the sound of the struggle, holding axes. So Lincoln emerges.
Get rid of Richard Parker there.
He is not yet a Republican. There is no real organized national Republican Party. There are some radicals who, in Illinois, radical abolitionists, who call themselves Republicans. They approach Lincoln. They ask him, will he assume the leadership of this party? Initially, he says no. Finally, he says to his law partner, we'll join them, radicals and all. And he organizes the Illinois Republican Party. He's the political figure all sides want. It's a very fragile coalition of different groups and parties, people who've hated each other for a long time. And this party is organized nationally as well. They lose their first election in 1856. John C. Fremont, U.S. Senator from California and the Western explorer, is the candidate. He's basically subjected to the first birther campaign. He's accused of not being a native born American, and as well, something even worse, a secret Catholic. So Lincoln decides he will run for president after he loses his Senate race to Stephen Douglas. He becomes a national figure as a result of the debates with Douglas, which are printed in all the newspapers around the country. These famous debates about how to deal with the problem of the extension of slavery and the issue of slavery itself. Lincoln decides he will run a kind of stealthy campaign. He's very much a dark horse. He goes to Cooper Union and delivers a speech. He's invited by the notables, the eminences of New York. They want to see what he looks like. They read about him through these debates. And he delivers a stunning speech laying out all of the arguments of the moment against slavery and the constitutional basis of being anti-slavery and claiming the Constitution for the cause.
This is a picture of him at the time he gives that speech, taken by Matthew Brady, I think.
Matthew Brady is the most famous photographer of the day. He has a gallery on Lower Broadway, and all the great and the good want to have their picture taken by Brady. And on the day of the Cooper Union address, those who had invited Lincoln took him there to have his picture taken. Brady fussed with his suit, which was all wrinkled. Pulled down, you can see his cuff. The other cuff didn't come down exactly. Gave him a book to put his hand down so he would look erudite. Pulled his collar up so his long neck wouldn't show. And if you can see on the left, there's a column. That's a fake column to give him a kind of classical sense of being a almost Roman-like statesman. This photograph became the photograph of the 1860 campaign after Lincoln's nomination. It was the greatest image making for Lincoln nationally in the campaign of 1860. And Lincoln said, Matthew Brady made me president.
Sidney, you've mentioned that Lincoln was kind of an awkward person. He wasn't a natural kind of extrovert. Can you talk a little bit about how he was received in New York and how he was received in general because of his manner?
Yeah, Lincoln was not seen as a sophisticated figure. He spoke in a high-pitched voice. He had a Kentucky accent, people say, and his clothes were not always, well-pressed or well-fitting. Mary Lincoln worried about him and fussed about him. She said he didn't know pink from blue. When he appeared at Cooper Union, his hair was messed up. His suit wasn't properly pressed. So people underestimated him. They thought he was a hayseed. They thought he was a rube. And Lincoln often received that reception and perception. And he was very aware of that effect on people. And at the same time, there could have been no greater um, distance between his outward appearance when people first met him and his inner self, and how he would project it when he was on the stage. And so when he spoke at Cooper Union, initially people thought, who is this hayseed? Why? And he's speaking in this awkward voice too. And by the end, they were standing up and cheering and waving handkerchiefs. One of the journalists, a famous journalist of the day, said, I feel as though I've heard a St. Paul speak. So Lincoln had, part of Lincoln's effect in his appearances with people was the distance between his inner and outer self.
What did he say that was so striking to people at that talk?
Lincoln took for the anti-slavery politics was a very distinct thing. It was different from what William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, believed. They were not radical abolitionists, all those engaged in political activity. The number of the radical abolitionists, especially the Garrisonians, hated politics and regarded it as inherently corrupt, and they would not participate in it. So to participate in the political process itself, to change things, meant that you were different from the Garrisonians. The Garrisonians believed that the Constitution was a pact with the devil, that it was a pro-slavery document. The anti-slavery political people argued that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, and they made long arguments about those who had opposed slavery, those who didn't believe in slavery, the true beliefs of the founders on slavery and what they expected. And Lincoln put that all together through prodigious research in this speech at Cooper Union, making the case that the anti-slavery people stood on the Constitution against the pro-slavery people. He was not going to cede the Constitution, concede it to the pro-slavery forces, to the South. He was going to take it for his own cause. So he does that, and then he makes political arguments about what the pro-slavery forces demand of the anti-slavery forces and how they seek to intimidate them, to compromise them, and to deny them any legitimacy. And in the end, he makes the famous statement condemning them, which is, right makes might, not might makes right. Right makes might. It's an argument that would have resonance today against a president who says you have to dominate.
I wasn't trying to cut off any anti-Trump points. I was just trying to say, people, you can send in any questions on chat and we'll put some of them to Sidney, not all, I'm afraid, but some. He was consistently anti-slavery, but it would not be true to say that he believed in racial equality, would it?
Well, that's a complex question of its day. He believed that all Black people were entitled to the same rights as all white people. And he made that argument in his debates with Stephen Douglas. He also had, on a personal level, many relationships with Black people, including in Springfield, Illinois, which had a free Black community. And there's a lot of recent research, including in my book, about his relations with those people in that community. So I think Lincoln also is unusual in his rhetoric, in that, unlike a lot of the abolitionists who sought to elicit outrage and sympathy for the slave, Lincoln often took the point of view of the slave himself or herself in trying to explain to people what the situation was. The title of my third volume, All the Powers of Earth, comes from a speech that Lincoln gave, in which he says all the powers of earth are basically conspired against the slave and have him locked in his cell, and that the cell is locked with 100 keys held by 100 men in 100 different places. And that's a description of the kind of power held against the slave power. So Lincoln, Lincoln also develops a personal relationship with Frederick Douglass that's very interesting on a personal level. Douglass is a radical abolitionist, begins as a Garrisonian, is very critical of Lincoln, including through the war, criticizes him for being often too, what he believes is too hesitant, too slow, too vacillating on emancipation, and yet is stunned when he meets with Lincoln in the White House and feels that he was treated in a very unusual way as an equal. Lincoln asks him to make sure that the Emancipation Proclamation is spread far and wide among Blacks in the South. In the end, there's a famous incident on the day of Lincoln's second inauguration, March 4th, 1865, where the party is held at the White House. And Douglass comes to the White House and he's being excluded by guards. He says, well, Lincoln has invited me. And they go and they see, and Lincoln has invited him. Lincoln summons him over. And Douglass says, well, I don't want to disturb you. He says, no, I'm very interested in what you thought of my inaugural address. And Douglass says, it was a sacred effort. And Lincoln says, I value no one's opinion more than yours. So the Lincoln stories, we could go on, but it's a very complex story.
Let's jump to the next photo, Pamela, because many presidents before Lincoln had been military leaders and were elected president because of that. With Lincoln, it went the other way around. Suddenly he's the commander-in-chief in a war for which nothing in his experience has prepared him. This is Lincoln at Antietam. Can you tell us about this photo and how he took or didn't take to the role of military leader?
Lincoln had served as an elected captain in a militia during the Black Hawk War against an Indian tribe as a young man. It was his first elected position. He was held in contempt by the person who organized the Army of the Potomac, George V. McClellan, who came from a prominent Philadelphia family, was a West Pointer, looked down upon Lincoln as he said, a guerrilla, unkempt, beneath him, socially inferior. Lincoln studied military affairs. He took many books out from the Library of Congress and read them, but he also developed a very close relationship with his second Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who had a telegraph office in the Department of War, where Lincoln spent much of his time monitoring movements and became something of a military strategist. McClellan was very slow, very methodical, and did not agree with Lincoln on the politics once Lincoln had moved towards the Emancipation Proclamation. McClellan was completely opposed to it. He was very well connected to prominent conservative Democrats in New York. Lincoln is here at Antietam. Antietam is a crucial place and a crucial battle because Lincoln was prepared to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, but he had been advised by his Secretary of State, William Seward, don't do it in a vacuum because you won't receive enough political support. Wait until you have a prominent victory. Lincoln had terrible relations with McClellan, but previous generals had failed. He tried one after another. They'd all been defeated. So he brought back McClellan, who fought at the Battle of Antietam and defeated Lee on his first invasion of the North. This is a battle in Maryland. Because of this battle and the Union victory, Lincoln then uses it on in its aftermath to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. In this photo, he's the man whose hand is in his jacket is Alan Pinkerton, the private eye, private detective who was McClellan's chief of military intelligence and always overestimated the size of Lee's army, which contributed to McClellan's instinctive hesitance on moving forward. Lincoln was angered by how McClellan handled the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam, and that he did not pursue Lee and destroy his army. And so the war went on as a result. And yet, out of that victory, Lincoln was able to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's the significance of this photograph.
Then we come to the last couple of photos, Pamela, I think you can show us them, of Lincoln's short life. This is Lincoln. Pamela, do you have the one with him with one of his surviving sons in February 1865? Where is he at this point in his final months? How is he seen by others?
This is Lincoln with his son, Tad. His older son, Robert, is off at Harvard and will plead with the family to join the war, and joins the general staff of General Grant. This is young Tad. Willie had died in 1862 of typhus, which devastated the family. A previous child, Edward, had died in 1850 of tuberculosis. Tad was a lively, impish, and learning disabled boy that Lincoln doted on and let run wild in the White House. Lincoln here is, I don't know the exact date of this photograph.
I think it's February 1865.
February 1865. Lincoln is a month away from his second inaugural. He's working on it. General Grant is in the trenches south of Richmond, on lines stretching almost 100 miles, in trench warfare, very much like World War I. The war is inconclusive, but Grant has a preponderance of military force and power, and will soon jump out of his trenches in April to attack, leading to Appomattox. So Lincoln has gotten through. The war is not resolved. Lincoln is considering the issues of the end of the war. He believes that things will resolve itself, but he does not have it clearly in view. And here he is with his son. Here's Lincoln. You can see the effects of the burdens of office in his face. He had entered as a vigorous young man, virtually unlined face, and he had had many sleepless nights, took the deaths from the war deeply, and was constantly anxious and engaged in every aspect of the strategy of the war and concluding it on a fair basis. Felt the pain of the war here.
We're in a situation now that I'm sure Lincoln would understand a lot of and recognize. This isn't a historical question, but how would he understand, do you think, the protests, the police violence, Trump's reaction to it all?
Well, a lot of this happened in Lincoln's day. It was different, but he would have recognized this and the politics of it as familiar. There were large protests against the Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s. There was a federal Fugitive Slave Act passed as part of the Compromise of 1850, and there were mass riots across the country against this act, including in Boston, where a crowd stormed the police station where a fugitive slave had been kept and was about to be deported back to slavery, and the crowd killed a policeman. Anthony Burns was the name of the slave. So Lincoln would have been very familiar with this kind of these kinds of mass protests. He had seen them. And what would Lincoln think? Well, Lincoln wanted to resolve the question on the side of his basic principle, the foundation of his politics, the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. And he also was keenly political and sought to create a more perfect union. Let's just take one incident. Trump's visit to the St. John's Church, his photo op, where at the instigation of William Barr, he cleared the Lafayette Park across from the White House of protesters who were peaceful, and so that he could stand holding a Bible in front of this church. Well, that is a church that in Lincoln's transition to the presidency, he visited. He was brought there by William Seward, who was about to become Secretary of State, who was senator from New York, who was a parishioner there. And Lincoln was working on his first inaugural. And we all know what he said in his first inaugural. He appealed to the mystic chords of memory that unite us. And he appealed to the better angels of our nature. A message exactly the opposite of what we heard and hear from the White House today.
Pamela, go for it. You have a question.
Yeah, I mean, Sidney, you are someone who's very connected to Washington politics still. Can you talk a little bit about how you see Trump kind of handling the next months we have before the inauguration, before the election? I know you've talked about a sort of King Kong analogy.
Yeah. Well, I had actually first thought of the King Kong analogy when Trump came into office, if we want to talk about King Kong, in a piece that I wrote for the London Review of Books about Trump that people can read. It appeared in February of 2017. It was a really long piece, 10,000 word piece. And King Kong, you know, breaks loose and he rampages across New York and he climbs the Empire State Building and he's shot down. But the thing is, King Kong became a sympathetic figure, and he cares for the Beauty and the Beast, and saves her at the end. And King Kong's a much more sympathetic figure than Trump, who is rampaging and through the city and just wreaking destruction. No one knows what damage will take place day by day. He's panicked. He's fearful. He's gotten bad polls. He, unlike any other president except Nixon, knows that he can be prosecuted when he leaves office if he's not pardoned. And he's desperate. This is a desperate man willing to use any means. Day by day, we're astonished and startled by the news. This morning, we hear that the Secretary of Defense, Esper, has broken with Trump on his use of federal troops to quell the protests. After Esper was dragged into this photo op as a prop in front of St. John's Church. I mean, the disintegration is sort of constant. Although, you can also say, if you want to use a psychiatric term, his inner disintegration is also constant, but there's no bottom to it. He's just constantly falling, and everything around him he pulls with him. So we don't know what damage will take place. I think we've learned that William Barr will be his both enabler and instigator all the way through it. So it's very dangerous going into this election. What he might do, his invocation of the Insurrection Act and emergency powers involving a peaceful demonstration at Lafayette Park suggests he might possibly invoke emergency powers going into the election if there are disruptions and or he fosters them.
Sidney,
So,
if we go on.
Yeah, so I think we're in, it's a cliche to say we're in uncharted waters, but we don't know what'll happen, and we don't know what level of violence might happen, and that's the great danger.
Just zooming out from Trump for a minute, and this is my last question. The complexion of this country, its divisions, look remarkably familiar to those that confronted Lincoln. The states in the Confederacy are now very largely Trump-supporting states. How much continuity do you see on the issues of race and the division of the country between 1860 and today, leaving aside the very different presidents?
When Lincoln had become a Republican, which was a new identity for him, he had been a Whig his whole life, and he sought to bring into the Republican Party the small d Democratic part of it. Remember, he's bringing in anti-slavery dissident Democrats, and he claims that side of Jefferson for the Republican Party. And he says, it reminds me of a story, because things would remind Lincoln of a story. And the story was of two men late at night on a street in Springfield who were drunk. And he says they were so drunk they fought their ways into each other's coats. He says, and that's what's going on today. We fought our way into each other's coats. And he's claiming we represent the true legacy of Jefferson, by which he means the Declaration of Independence. And the other side, they've given it up. And so what's happened with the party that Lincoln founded is that it has given up its Lincolnian legacy. And it's fought its way into becoming a very different kind of party, more a party that has the legacy of the, in truth, the Confederacy, and then the aftermath, the Dixiecrat Party, a third party that was segregationist. These are not exact analogies and not the exact programs, but this party, the Republican Party, Lincoln would understand the transformation, the realignment of parties, and understand how parties could change complexion. Because he had experienced it himself.
Sidney, thanks a million for this very erudite and articulate presentation of Lincoln. Before we go on to thank you, just to say on Friday at the same time, we have Alan Riding talking about artists coping, collaborating or resisting in Paris under Vichy, under German occupation. Now, thanks all for coming to Pandemonium U. We hope to see you